speaker. He's a former railroader, had the fortune to retire about 3 years ago, but has still stayed active in the Washington, D.C. area, among other things helping get the BLET State Legislative Board in the district up and going. I welcome to the podium somebody who's been working to exonerate the brothers in Canada ever since that occurred. Welcome, brother Fritz Edler.
The thing that we're going to talk about right now is quite familiar to most RW members, but there are people here who don't know a lot of the background. And I'm going to start out by asking, to a certain extent, for your working with me on the fact that the subject we're going to talk about is really something that deserving of a book-length examination of all the different issues and things that are involved in it. But we don't have anything like that time. And one of the most important things is not just to go over all of the details, but to do a little bit of an assessment and also to engage in the kind of discussion about from the point of view of an organization. So there's the issues of what happened in Lac-Mégantic, there's the issues of the solidarity campaign, there's the issues of what happened to those individual railroaders, what it means for the future, but then there's also the question of, as RWU, what does this mean and what lessons do we take from it and whatnot. So I'm going to call on a couple of people after a little bit to talk about parts that they specifically played and things that they know, and then we need to also have discussion. So there are going to be many things that will not be resolved in the course of what I'm going to talk about right now. But to start off, just so everybody's all on the same page, July 6th, 2013, in the small town of about 6,000 people in rural Quebec, a runaway train, 74 cars long, carrying only Bakken crude, volatile, explosive crude oil, rolled into the town on its own, wrecked, blew up, killed 47 people immediately. About at least another three people have died since then, many by their own hands out of the despair and the horror of the things that they've experienced. And left all kinds of devastation. Most of the downtown is destroyed and whatnot, and it captured the attention of the world. In the immediate aftermath of that wreck, the U.S.-based owner of the railroad, the Montreal, Maine and Atlantic, a guy named Ed Burkhart, came to the town and praised the single crew member engineer, a guy named Tom Harding, a name that's very familiar to a lot of us, initially as a hero. Within a couple of days of that time that happened, when various things started to develop, he is the man who is the architect of the idea that Tom Harding and only Tom Harding bore the responsibility for what happened there, that all prosecutorial focus should be on him, that the government should focus on him. And guess what? That's exactly what happened. That's exactly what happened going forward with that. Now, some folks in RWU who've been actively involved in this and participating in stuff would be excused for thinking that, okay, well, whatever, but it is done because there's been a criminal trial and the individuals were exonerated and various other proceedings took place. However, as it happens, I don't know whether you want to call it fortuitous or not, some developments have happened in the last 48 hours that make clear why this is still a very pertinent question on all these different scales. That news is that the Canadian government has decided that they will not prosecute the MMA at all. All along, for the last 4+ years, they've always said, oh yeah, we'll hold the railroad responsible, but first of all, we're going to get these guys, these railroad workers. And the judge in the trial made the decision to separate a trial out specially aside for the MMA and then put the 3 railroad workers on trial first. This was all part of a plan. Well, anyway, so now they've announced that, you know what, they're not going to prosecute the railroad. Not a big surprise. I contacted Tom Walsh, who is the lead attorney for the case, and he said, first of all, that they're terribly disappointed, but that it was basically to be expected, and that the government's justification for the non-prosecution is laughable. And that justification, as reported by Canadian Broadcasting Company, whatnot, is that because there was an acquittal for Tom Harding and his co-workers, that there's no stomach for, and not enough, not a good enough case to make to prosecute the railroad. Not that it would have really mattered anyway, for a couple of important reasons. One of which was that the railroad is bankrupt and has no assets and didn't even present it, doesn't even have an attorney. And in addition to which, all of the principals involved, all the managers involved, and everybody in this room who's a railroader knows how this works, all the managers involved are covered by a liability insurance policy that guarantees that any financial penalties that they get are paid for by the insurance. Not by the assets of the railroad, but by the insurance. And anybody who's not in management is not covered by that. That's another story we could talk about at length. But first of all, let's talk about how this started out. So in 2013, in the immediate aftermath of the wreck, and the various things started to come out, and Ed Burkhardt had targeted Tom Harding, and the government had gone for it. After a year, as many people have seen the pictures, they saw the brothers lined up in chains with SWAT teams guarding them. This is a year after the accident, by the way. It's not an accident. It was a wreck. We shouldn't call it an accident. A year after the wreck, their frog marched off in front of the cameras as part of the propaganda campaign to present them as the only really guilty parties. And it was a travesty that it ended up in a prosecution of the workers, but in one respect, especially since it turned out the way that it did, it was a great opportunity because it allowed for the public exposure of the policies, the risky and dangerous policies of the railroad and how that worked, to come out into the public sphere in a way that we all know just generally never actually happens. There's several reasons why people would, be excused for saying, well, why did we focus on these guys and not on any number of our other coworkers that find themselves in similar situations? There's a couple of things. I mean, first of all, in cases like this, it is the duty of militant railroad workers who understand, workers in general, to do labor solidarity. So you have to figure out what your best ways that you can do that. Some cases will present more opportunities than others. And I guess that's the key to the situation here at hand. What we find out is that we have an obligation to do that where we can, and we figure out what the different possibilities are, and we find out that we can fight. I was having a conversation with Shelley a little earlier, and the point is that these situations, we don't create them, we don't craft them. They're somewhat like a pregnancy, which is it's a fact. Once it happens, only thing you can do is figure out how to make the outcome as good as you can possibly figure out how to do. So this is essentially what we did, and we find out that we can fight and we can accomplish remarkable things when we do that. And the RWU brought credit upon itself on an international level by a lot of the work that we did in regard to this case. And I should say, for those people who haven't been following it, of course, that after 4.5 years, it finally ended in, after a real cliffhanger kind of 9-day deliberation, an acquittal on all charges, 9 charges each for those brothers, which was a remarkable thing. And I'll just say this, I had it in mind to say later, but it's that, we can claim some real important credit, But we also have to acknowledge that it's the people of Quebec themselves who are the real heroes of this story, because they're the ones who understood fundamentally in a very, very broad way that the way they always expressed it to me on the streets of Megantic was they got the wrong guys. Think about how many of the communities that we operate in where the person on the street generally understands those things. But that was one of the many reasons why this case was important for us. First of all, it was at the very core of a lot of the things that everything we're going to talk about this weekend and I've always talked about. So schedules, work schedules. In this case, they didn't have enough people, even though they had cut back so that they were only running single-person crews, to even staff their regular schedules. So Tom Harding was working his day off. They didn't have anybody to do the job, and as one of the things that's sort of obvious when you check these things out is not only did they not have enough people, but they didn't have anybody to call in the event of a bad thing. And that fact, which all of you have experienced at one time or another, is an important key of why this thing went bad, because if they'd had plenty of people, if they'd had qualified people available who knew what they were supposed to be doing and whatnot, we wouldn't probably be having this conversation now. There's the infrastructure question. The infrastructure both in terms of track, in terms of the equipment itself, and so many bad things came out about the way that the MMA took care of their equipment. Shine a bright light on policies that may have been a little more crazy on the MMA, but they're basically the kind of stuff that happen on every railroad. The single-person crew question, longer and heavier trains. Longer and heavier in the sense of that they made it impossible, for example, to use an available protected siding that would have prevented this kind of a problem. Just reckless policies. They're not only internal policies that that the railroad never has any culpability, and that you'll always blame the last guy. And Nancy Lesson will be speaking later on the behavior-based safety, which is a training model, but it's about the mentality. It's the mentality of our bosses, how they operate. The unions, in the very beginning, did some fairly good lip service on the question, but fairly quickly got scared because there was the narrative that was put out there that this was a horrible railroad worker who had broken the rules and he'd been reckless and it's all his fault and whatnot, and they fell away. And part of it was the division, which one of the reasons why the RWU exists is because of the divisions between all the different rail unions and why we need to be together. But that being said, the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen and the UTU and the steelworkers, which organized the railroad in that case and whatnot, made some good statements. Some money was raised, etc., but they quickly withdrew. And they didn't engage again until after the verdict was won. After the verdict was won, then they made statements again. And for example, the steelworkers, and I dealt with a lot of the rail steelworkers in Canada, had a million excuses. But that really meant that left it up to people like ourselves. And we found out that when we would do that work, we could find other people who would do that work also. And I'm going to call on some of them. I'm afraid I'm going to run out of time here. But let me review some of the things we did. In the very beginning, one of the things we had Tom Walsh attend our Chicago Railroad Workers Community Safety Conference. He spoke there. We got into a bunch of conversations. We knew that the people in Megantic were having a rally against the resumption of volatile oil trains. So I went up there representing Railroad Workers United, expressing solidarity, marched with them, spoke at their events, met the key people, made connections, and then we went on from there. We started campaigning to get different locals around the country to pass resolutions, make donations, whatnot. There were other people who were already doing some solidarity. At least one of his former co-workers had early on organized a fundraising event. We organized petitioning across the country. In the petitioning throughout the United States, across English and French-speaking Canada, we were able to get over 3,000 people involved in, explicitly calling for the dropping of the charges against those individuals and holding the actual culpable railroad bosses responsible. In general, in the course of this whole business, we reached tens of thousands of people who would not have ordinarily known about it. And it's one of the important things about changing that narrative. Even within RWU, and this is, everybody knows this is true. There were a lot of people within RWU initially who were like, well, the guy, he only put on 7 handbrakes. You got to talk about what the real dangers are. Where do the real dangers come from? We had to change that whole conversation, because if you really want rail safety, you got to hold the real people responsible. We did, nationwide things where we called selfies of solidarity, where people in their workplaces all across the country posted pictures saying, drop the charges and things like that. We organized fundraising concerts in 2 cities and then had another event in a 3rd city with musicians and community activists and labor people and whatnot, not only to spread the word, but to just raise money for the social media campaign. All the money that we raised went into spreading the word. It all went into different aspects of the social media campaign. We testified for the NTSB in their single crew member hearings, tying that question directly with the question of Lac-Mégantic. As folks know, many of the people here, especially as it got close to the end and we knew that it was building to a climax, Worker Solidarity Action Network, a number of individual Solidarity members here, stepped up to the plate at the most critical time in this proceeding and organized pickets at Canadian consulates in different cities across the country. I have a couple of pictures of some of those. And then at the end, we organized a phone calling campaign, because after the acquittals, then there was a federal process. And in the federal process, Harding, for example, was forced, because of the nature of the laws and the circumstances, to actually plead guilty. And then there was a little show theater thing where they had 5 managers that, gave up their liability insurance money and whatnot. The result of this, though, was that not only did we show what we're capable of and what more we could do, in other words, there's a lot of missed opportunities, missed chances and things that we could have done better, which is something that's worthy of discussion. We did change that narrative. Social media was an important part of this. The money we raised in general was used to involve more people. So Shelley can show right now, we'll show one of the things that was a result of the close collaborative work that we did together. And the Real News Network did this one interview that we were able to show to 60,000 people, mostly in Canada,